So Erev Tov, everybody. It's wonderful to be together on this chilly evening for the latest installment in our TBS Bioethics Initiative, something that we're very proud of as we bring together all sorts of conversations from experts in the field about important issues in bioethics and thinking about how they relate to our Jewish values and how our Judaism can help inform some of the challenging issues of our time. Tonight, we are very excited to have with us Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts Belser, who I'll introduce in a moment. Before we do that, I just want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Audrey and Yale Asbell, Dr. Jeff and Jane Kramer, Kent and Kent, and the Ravitz Family Acts of Kindness Fund, the Ravitz Family Fund, that help support our program as well. And also, of course, to Jeff and to Greg Bannett, who do a wonderful job in helping us find wonderful scholars like Julia, who we'll get to learn from tonight and helping put together this initiative. I want to make sure that everybody knows that at the end of April 27th to the 29th, we have a Scholar in Residence weekend that is in partnership with our Bioethics Initiative and our Rabbi Lindemann Lifelong Learning Program Fund. And that is with Dr. Michal Rauscher. Dr. Rauscher is a wonderful scholar at the University of Cincinnati who's a JTS ethics fellow. Her specialty is in infertility and surrogacy and the ethics of that. Her research has been in the religious community in Israel about surrogacy there, but her topics are very wide. And she's going to be with us April 27th and 29th. There'll be a Friday night dinner and sessions on Shabbat and also Sunday morning. That information will be coming out soon. Just want to make sure you mark your calendars for that weekend. It should be a wonderful way to come and to learn with Professor Rauscher. Now tonight, we are having our program on disabilities because this month, the month of February, is National Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month. Of course, at TBS, this is something that we take seriously not just in the month of February, but all year round. We have our Yachad group, and I see Sarah Kreisman here, who is fundamental in founding our Yachad group that helps provide us experiences, services and other programs and learning for those with special needs and their families in our community. It's a program that we're very proud of here. And we thought it'd be a wonderful way to help mark this month and to think about Jewish bioethics by bringing in Rabbi Watts Belser to speak about forging a disability-sensitive Jewish bioethics. And let me share with you a little bit about Rabbi Watts Belser, and then I'll add one more personal piece. She is an associate professor of Jewish studies at the Theology Department at Georgetown University, with expertise in rabbinic literature and Jewish feminist ethics. Her most recent scholarly book is Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem. And she's held a faculty fellowship in women's studies and religion at Harvard and is currently a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We know that we're very lucky that Rabbi Watts Belser is in our community this year, in Summerdale, actually. So if you need dental work, we know some people who can help you with that.
Maybe we'll make a connection.
She's living in Summerdale and on a sabbatical. She's teaching at the Katz Center and doing some research there. And I've had the opportunity to get to know her as she's been in the community this year through this initiative, and also for some work I'm doing on the law committee for the conservative movement and writing a tshuva, a response about people with intellectual disabilities, along with our friend Rabbi Joel Seltzer, who's the director from Poconos. And we've been talking about those with intellectual disabilities and halakha, and Julia has been very generous with her time and her input in advising us as we've been working on that paper, and it's been wonderful for me to have a chance to get to know her and learn from her in that context, and I'm very excited that we all have the chance to learn from her tonight as well. So Julia is going to start with her talk. Afterwards, we'll have a chance for some questions and answers, for some conversation in here as well, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Julia Watts Belser.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here with your community. So, about a month ago, I caught the following headline from The Atlantic splashed across my screen. Is a cure for blindness worth $1 million? In December, the FDA approved the path-breaking gene therapy Luxturna, a treatment developed at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia by the Philadelphia-based Spark Therapeutics. Luxturna has the potential to restore partial sight to people with a particular form of hereditary vision loss. Though you might miss those caveats if you read articles like this one from Forbes, which hails Luxturna as a new drug and a medical miracle, one that, quote, literally allows blind people to see. Luxturna is one of a number of recent breakthroughs in human gene editing that have been hailed as a new era of medicine, offering biomedical researchers the ability to make targeted changes to the human genome, adding, removing, or altering the DNA of living organisms. One of the most promising of these technologies is commonly known as CRISPR, short for clustered, regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. You don't need to repeat that. CRISPR acts like a pair of molecular scissors. Right? So when it's paired with a particular molecular guide, it allows scientists to edit the genomic code. You can think of it as basically snipping, adding, changing, and then reforming. CRISPR has a tremendous number of potential uses, from plant genetics to advances in animal and human health, from targeted cancer therapies to improved organ transplants, as well as treatments for genetic diseases. A 2015 study demonstrated successful use of CRISPR to induce functional gene corrections for cystic fibrosis, at this point just in laboratory settings. A 2014 study used CRISPR in mice to prevent the genetic expression of a certain form of muscular dystrophy, while a 2016 study showed CRISPR editing could improve the muscle function of live mice with muscular dystrophy. So these are advances that I think are really bringing CRISPR technology closer to clinical implementation in humans. These are extraordinary developments. They are technologies, in my view, that offer tremendous promise and also that raise significant ethical dilemmas. Now, while Luxturna, the blindness therapy I described at first, works by making changes to the body cells of a specific individual, just one individual person, gene therapies, other forms of gene therapy, have the potential to change what's known as the germline. So this is an important distinction here. Right? Germline therapy changes the genes of an embryo or the reproductive cells. And so if you're doing germline gene therapy, it permanently alters not just one individual, but all future generations that come from that genetic line. Okay? So because of its long-term effects on an entire genetic line, germline therapy raises a lot of ethical concerns. Right? Particularly raises concerns about what bioethicists tend to call downstream effects. That is, the prospect that you might make one genetic modification and then it has a cascade of unanticipated consequences. Okay? If you make that just in one individual, in an individual person's body cells, that's of course a potential tragedy for that individual. Okay? But if you're making it if you're making a germline change, okay, then those downstream effects have consequences not just for one person, but for the entire genetic line. Okay? Does that distinction make sense? Okay. So because of these concerns, there are presently very significant restrictions on the use of germline therapy in human beings. The United States government currently prohibits the use of federal funding for germline therapies. An important 1997 International Treaty on Bioethics and Human Rights likewise prohibits gene therapies that would introduce any modification in the genome of descendants. So right now there's sort of open permission to do genetic therapy, gene therapies on an individual, but not something that would affect the germline. 20 years after this treaty, some scientists argue that it is now time to redraw those lines, that it is now time to open up opportunities for germline gene therapy, particularly to respond to significant disability conditions. Tonight, what I want to argue is that it is imperative to bring those debates, these kind of debates about gene therapy, into conversation with principles that are formed in disability activist communities. And I want to argue, furthermore, that we must not go forward without a substantive way to take seriously the critiques and objections against those kind of therapies that have been raised by certain disability communities. So, in support of that principle, I want to lift up the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, also known as CRPD. CRPD is a human rights treaty that was developed by the United Nations in 2006. I basically feel I can't talk about CRPD without acknowledging that the United States has actually quite shamefully, in my opinion, still refused to ratify that treaty. But let's leave that aside for the moment. Okay? So CRPD articulates a fundamental ethical principle that in matters of disability policy and practice, those who are most affected have the right to participate in decisions that impact them. So this principle recognizes people with disabilities as stakeholders who have a right to participate in decisions that affect us. When it comes to matters of politics and policy, however, this principle has rarely been put into practice in a substantial way. So tonight, what I want to do is think with you first about some of the critiques and objections that certain specific disability communities have raised with regard to techniques or therapies that might eliminate their disabilities. Now, I imagine that might strike you as somewhat counterintuitive. Generally speaking, when I speak with audiences, right, the quest to eliminate disability strikes many people as an obvious good. Right? This is often framed as a way to reduce suffering, to improve human flourishing, to move us even more closer to a more perfect world. But for some deaf and disability activists, these claims strike a very different note. So that's what I want to explore with you first. Let's consider the concerns raised by Rebecca Coakley. Rebecca Coakley is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She's working specifically on disability policy. She was quite recently the executive director of the National Council on Disability. Coakley is a person of short stature, and dwarfism has been in her family for generations. John Wasmuth discovered the genetic signature for her disability in 1994. Right? She writes, "He was searching for the Down syndrome gene and found us. I remember my mother's horrified reaction when she heard the news." Coakley draws attention to the striking difference between the general public acclaim surrounding such discoveries and the way this news was met within her own community, the fear it provoked. Her editorial's title, "Please Don't Edit Me Out." Disability experience is a core part of Coakley's identity. "I am who I am," she says, "because I have dwarfism. Dwarfs share a rich culture, as do most disability groups. We have traditions, common language, and histories rich in charismatic ancestors." In deaf communities, we find a similar claim, that deafness is a minority culture, that sign language is a linguistic minority, perennially under siege in a predominantly hearing world. Contentions over deaf erasure burst on the scene with the rise of cochlear implants, first approved by the FDA in 1985. So cochlear implants are a technology that use a sound processor and internal implant that stimulates the cochlear nerve in order to bypass the usual conventional hearing process. And cochlear implants allow many people who were born deaf or people who have profound hearing loss to have access to sound. Cochlear implants, when they first came out, and to a certain extent still today, provoked tremendous controversy. They were widely heralded in the hearing world, right, my world, as a kind of miracle technology, a revolutionary breakthrough. But there were also really strong protests that emerged against these technologies in the deaf community. They argued that mainstream embrace of cochlear implants was an assault on deaf culture and community. Another part of a long line of efforts to eradicate signed language and shatter the bonds of language, culture, and kinship between deaf people, ultimately designed to force deaf individuals to assimilate into mainstream society. Now, these days, I think the cochlear implant divide has grown less dichotomized. Deaf activists still raise serious concerns about the technology and rhetoric surrounding cochlear implants, which I think many see as a kind of fear-mongering about deaf life. But increasingly, we see organizations like the National Association of the Deaf, a leading deaf culture and advocacy organization, as working to build pathways to deaf culture for all deaf people, including those with cochlear implants. Increasingly, deaf kids who receive cochlear implants as children are being raised as deaf, which gives them then access to both signed and spoken language. CRISPR, though, right, that gene editing technology, threatens to upend that hard-won balance. A 2016 study in mice suggests a potential new gene therapy for treating hereditary deafness. Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke, an associate professor of philosophy at Gallaudet University, one of the world's few deaf bioethicists, writes incisively about the ethical concerns here. Gene therapy is decidedly different from cochlear implant surgery. Deaf children with a cochlear implant, Burke writes, are still deaf. Gene therapy, by contrast, closes off this life path. It is a permanent change, a fundamental alteration in a person's genes. These therapeutic choices, whether for cochlear implants or for potentially this CRISPR elimination of deafness, these choices are almost always made when children are very young. Right? That's partly because this is when it's the most effective window for treatment. It's when you have the opportunity to maximize a child's chance of successfully training their mind to hear, right? So that they're able to learn to make sense of sound. There's rarely a way for the person directly affected to have a meaningful say in the decision about their future. Right? They're kids. You can't ask them what they want in any meaningful way. Cochlear implant technology, though, right, even though that choice is made before a child is able to make the decision for themselves, still leaves open a path for children to become a part of the deaf world. Gene therapy doesn't. Burke likens genomic integrity to bodily integrity. It's widely recognized, she argues, that surgically altering gender-ambiguous genitalia, for example, can have a profound effect on the identity and well-being of a child. So too, she argues, decisions with altering the genome of deaf children. What's more, Burke says these technologies represent a profound threat to the vitality of deaf culture. It's not hard to imagine a scenario in which fewer and fewer children remain deaf, in which numbers dwindle enough that it becomes harder to pass on deaf language and culture. The threat, in Burke's words, of cultural genocide. Now, for hearing folks, I think it can be difficult to understand the stakes, to wrap our head around what's really at risk here. Most of us, I think, imagine deafness as a world without music, right? Or the sounds that give us pleasure. It can be hard to imagine anything but hearing loss, to consider deafness as anything but a diminishment of the sensory capacity that most of us, myself included, hold dear. Within the deaf world, though, it's common not to speak of hearing loss, but deaf gain. Right? Deaf gain is a recognition, a way of flipping the script, a recognition of the intricate beauty, joy, kinship, and vitality that deafness can bring to the world. So I'd like to draw a parallel here to Jewish experience, to the profound anxiety and fear that many Jews share at the thought that Jewishness might diminish, might be wiped out or eradicated. It's helpful, I think, to acknowledge that, yes, there are some challenges associated with being Jewish. Jewish identity is not without risk. Anti-Jewish violence has claimed millions of lives, and even today, Jews are target of outright hate or more subtle attempts at persuasion persuading us to give up our differences, our distinctiveness, to assimilate. And yet, for me, and I imagine for many of you, the thought of a world without Jews is an impoverished world, a world where something exquisite has been lost. That, for me, was one of the ways that I made an emotional connection, right? Grasped a sense of what was at stake for my deaf friends and colleagues, right? When they think about the prospect of a world with no more deaf kids. Now, let me be clear. Disability is an extraordinarily diverse category. The most recent US Census data suggests that nearly 1 in 5 Americans have a disability of some kind, whether physical, intellectual, sensory, mental health related. It's virtually impossible to say something meaningful about this entire body of people. If we were to imagine the attitudes to curative technology, right, or gene therapy among this whole group, I'd imagine we'd find extraordinary variation. Right? When it comes to medical intervention and healthcare decisions, people always, right? These are always extraordinarily personal decisions. People are weighing the risks and the benefits, the costs and the gains. These decisions are highly individual. So when I'm talking about crafting what I call disability-sensitive bioethics, I find it helpful to distinguish between the broad category of people who have a disabling condition or impairment of some kind, and then the smaller subset of people who have a political or cultural affiliation with disability, who claim disability as a meaningful part of our identities. I'd include myself as part of that smaller group. Now, even here, even if we're talking about that small subset of folks who feel disability, who claim disability as an important part of our identity, right? Even within that small subgroup, there are important, critical differences. For some disability groups, better medical treatment and the quest for a cure is an urgent political issue. Okay? I'm thinking here particularly of, or especially of advocacy work being done right now by people with chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalopathy, who've raised a sharp call for more research and better therapeutic options for people with chronic illness. Right? So it's important to acknowledge that I'm not talking here about the entire disability community, which I think is a sort of meaningless category, too broad to really be something we can speak about. We can't and must not reduce disability perspectives to a single voice. But amidst this complex landscape, when disability communities, when specific, that is, disability communities, raise concern about the implications of a technology or therapy, I argue we have got to take those claims seriously. Because these voices and these subject positions are often sidelined and marginalized. We must make particular effort to seek them out and give moral weight to their critiques. So I've offered 2 case studies tonight as a way of enfleshing the argument that the quest for the cure is not always benevolent, that curative technology is not without cost. Now again, notice I'm very purposefully not making a claim here that the curative impulse is always destructive, or that medical advances like these should never be pursued, especially in these days with Medicare and Medicaid under increasing attack, with the signature disability civil rights legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, in serious danger. It is more urgent than ever to stress, I want good healthcare access for people with disabilities, for elders, and for those living in poverty. A lot of my political energy and activism these days is directed toward precisely that end. But I also want us to recognize as a society that we cannot decouple medicine, health, and well-being from questions of power, from questions of agency and self-determination. Even good intentions can run roughshod over minority communities. So the scientific, medical, and bioethics communities urgently need, I think, better ways to seriously and substantively engage the critiques and challenges that are being raised by some disability communities. A task which, I think, means coming to better understand the way questions of cure and questions of medicine are often intertwined with questions of power. Now, can Jewish sources help shed light on these questions? I'm not going to try and tackle the question of gene therapy from the perspective of the Talmud. But what I do want to do is to illuminate the power dynamics of healing by turning to some rabbinic sources, by examining two stories about the destruction of the temple. These are stories about a rabbi whose disabled body becomes a site of struggle between the Roman Empire and particularly the Roman emperor and the conquered Jewish community of Judea. So let me first set the scene here a little bit and give you a word about the historical context. So I'm talking about the Roman destruction of the temple, right? The destruction of the temple and the ensuing conquest of Judea is often described as a watershed moment in ancient Jewish history. Right? So the destruction in 70 CE was a conquest that profoundly reshaped Jewish religious life and political fortunes. It's the conquest that basically spelled the end to independent Jewish political sovereignty in the land of Judea for thousands of years. In my most recent book, Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, I argue that disability and the visceral experience of the body is really central to a lot of Jewish stories about the experience of the Roman conquest of Jerusalem. So tonight what I want to do is lift up two of those stories and use them for a much more contemporary purpose, to use them to think with you about some of the power dynamics that I am interested in illuminating that surround technologies of cure and that ask us to think about the kind of meanings we give to the ongoing presence of disability in our midst. So these two stories are drawn from Lamentations Rabbah. Lamentations Rabbah is a Palestinian rabbinic midrash collection that's usually dated to the 5th or 6th century CE. And by Palestinian, I mean it was written by the rabbis living in Judea, in Jerusalem, not actually in Jerusalem, but in the region that we today call Israel, not in the other major center of Jewish life in the rabbinic period in Babylonia. Okay? So midrash is a genre of rabbinic literature that expands on and embellishes biblical verses, in this case the biblical book of Lamentations, which the rabbis use to think about the impact of the destruction. So both of the stories I want to talk about tonight focus on the life of Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok is a celebrated rabbi and priestly figure who's said to have fasted for 40 years in what was a failed attempt to stave off the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? Now, you may be thinking, oh, that's a really long time to fast. I mean, it is, right, a really long time to fast. We're not thinking entirely a sort of Yom Kippur-style fast. It's not quite such an extraordinary feat. We're imagining here a figure who he severely restricted his intake of food and water, but over the long haul, over 40 years, the rabbinic sources describe his activist interventions, his attempt to fast to keep destruction from happening, as coming with a powerful bodily cost. So the Midrash says his flesh became emaciated, he became really thin and really weak, his skin changed, becoming dark and dry and brittle. Now, the Midrash never explicitly uses the language of disability, which is a kind of modern concept. But I want to tonight read the stories of Rabbi Tzadok as narratives that allow us to think about the experience of acquired disability. Right? To think about Rabbi Tzadok as a man who experiences profound physical bodily change. For the rabbis, I think the stories of Rabbi Tzadok are a way of grappling with the imprint of Roman violence and thinking about the extraordinary change that Roman conquest brings. Lamentations Rabbah tells two different stories about our rabbi. Right? In the first, Tzadok is cured by the imperial physicians at the direction of the Roman general Vespasian. In the second, his body never heals. Right? So I want to talk about these two different stories. Taken together, I think, these tales offer us got a little ahead of myself there. These tales offer a potent meditation on questions of cure and the way it is bound up with politics and power. So, in the first story I want to look at, from Lamentations Rabbah 131, This Midrash recounts how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai negotiated with the Roman general Vespasian during the Roman siege of Jerusalem. So our story is set in Jerusalem. The city is under siege. The famous Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai negotiates with the Roman general and wins the right to rescue someone, one person, from the city before it falls. Who does Rabbi Yochanan save? Rabbi Tzadok. Now, Rabbi Tzadok strikes the Roman general as a very strange choice. In Vespasian's eyes, the Midrash tells us, Tzadok is small and shriveled and old. The mighty, powerful general is totally flummoxed. He says to Yochanan, "Why did you save this man?" In the exchange that follows, Yochanan makes plain Tzadok's spiritual power. He says to Vespasian, "Look, if there'd been another one like him in the city, you would never have taken Jerusalem, not even with double so many troops." So Vespasian asks him, what is his strength? How does this little guy have such an extraordinary strength? And Rabbi Yochanan praises the intensity of Tzadok's fasts. Even now, he says, Tzadok can teach 100 sessions in the academy with no more sustenance than a single fig. I'll confess, as a professor, I have longed for that strength. Now, we might be tempted to read this tale as a contrast between physical and spiritual power, but I don't think that's quite the way to do it. The Midrash here really emphasizes that Rabbi Tzadok's power arises not in spite of his body, but because of it. Rabbi Tzadok's body is a site of corporeal resistance. His fasting is deliberate, it's intentional, and it is a willful practice of transforming his body for the sake of saving the city. The last lines of this section of Lamentations Rabbah conclude with an account of Tzadok's bodily rehabilitation. So the general Vespasian, Roman general, summons doctors to tend to the frail rabbi, and they feed him little by little and gradually restore his body to health. Now, we could, I suppose, read this as a story of a kind of redemption story, right? The restoration of the great sage's body through the expert intervention of the physicians. But I want to read it differently. I don't trust Vespasian and his impulse to cure. That Vespasian, the Roman general, wants to heal Rabbi Tzadok is, I think, quite ironic. Right? At the very moment that Vespasian is having the physicians heal Tzadok, he and his armies are actively besieging the city of Jerusalem. So they're deliberately starving, right? A siege works by trying to cut off the city's capacity for food and water. So they're deliberately starving the Jewish residents and rebels within. At the same time, Vespasian agrees to save this one guy and decides to rescue him and cure him and restore him to health. So maybe it's a benevolent act. Maybe it's an act of kindness. Maybe it's a moment of charity. Frankly, I'm more inclined to see it as an example of what the disability studies scholar Eunjung Kim calls curative violence. Kim argues that cure is often a way of justifying control over disabled people, taking attention away from the social and structural needs, and instead exercising a kind of dominance over people's lives. Now, in this story, Vespasian's interest in cure does not strike me as the interest of a sensitive, thoughtful healer. It looks to me like the choice to force feed a hunger striker, right? Like a deliberate refusal of this man's right to protest. So in my reading, Vespasian recognizes the provocative power of Tzadok's fasting body, the weakened body that almost successfully challenged the armies of Rome. Vespasian recognizes it and neutralizes it. He brings in the physicians to neutralize Tzadok's chosen fast, denying Tzadok kind of sovereignty over his body, even as he claims to rescue and heal his flesh. So that's the first story of Rabbi Tzadok. Let's take a look at the second story, which offers a strikingly different account. Lamentations Rabbah 4:11 describes Rabbi Tzadok's body as lastingly changed. In this account, in this midrash, there's no healing. Rabbi Eliezer reports that his father's physical body remains permanently shrunken by his own fasting. Rabbi Tzadok's body is never restored to its original state. So what might we make of this midrashic assertion that Rabbi Tzadok's flesh does not heal? In Lamentations Rabbah 4:11, the incurable body of Rabbi Tzadok becomes a potent symbol for the rabbis for expressing the permanence of destruction. Rabbi Eliezer is forced to grapple with the changed body of his father, to admit the enduring transformation of his flesh. And Rabbi Tzadok's unhealed body, I think, serves as a kind of sign of the enduring physicality of exile and conquest. It's a way for the rabbis of giving symbolic expression to the unconsoled, unhealed state of the nation. So in this midrash, I think Tzadok's uncured body is a powerful symbol. It is a refusal to let the assault of exile and the transformation of conquest disappear without a trace. Now, let me say, as a person with a highly visible disability, I don't have a tremendous amount of patience for symbolic readings of disability like this. I get kind of irritated and frustrated with the attempt to sort of script onto disability experience a symbolic meaning that's all about tragedy and loss and despair and the destruction, blah, blah, blah. Especially in religious discourse, I think it's very common for disabled bodies to get used, right, lifted up in this way into other people's stories as symbols of tragedy or distress, or sometimes the converse, symbols of hope and healing, inspiration. Right? These symbolic readings make disability into a kind of metaphor, overwriting the real, tangible, complicated, fleshy body. So let me just say it plain. I'm not a symbol, I'm a self. So I want to turn back to Tzadok's story and read it a little bit differently. Tzadok, I think, doesn't have to solely be a symbol of enduring distress. So I want to give a couple different possible readings here, alternative readings of the second Tzadok story. First, if we imagine Tzadok as a body who resists healing, then we might hear a different kind of story, a story about the unabashedly disabled body, kind of story in which Tzadok is engaging in cultural protest. Read this way, I think of Tzadok as a kind of close cousin to a friend of mine, an amputee. She's not much fond of prosthetics, right? She finds them uncomfortable, ungainly, and not very effective. She has evolved better adaptive strategies without them, but non-disabled people, especially casual acquaintances and strangers on the street, are always coming up to her and trying to fix her up with better tech. Now, it's certainly possible that some of them have her best interests at heart. But mostly, my friend says, she thinks they just don't like to see a woman without a leg, right? They would feel more comfortable if she just looked a little more normal. We live in a highly medicalized age, in a culture that generally takes for granted the idea that it's a good thing to rehabilitate and to normalize, whenever possible, the disabled body. So let me just say again, rehabilitation has been, for many of us, myself included, a tremendous boon. Okay? So I don't want to knock rehabilitation as a concept or a practice, but I am suspicious of the way it can become an imperative. Rehabilitation as a cultural imperative functions as a means of silencing disability as a kind of difference, of pressing the complexities of the body into a neat and normalized form. So one way I like to read the story of Tzadok's unhealed body is as a kind of midrashic resistance to the imperative to heal, a refusal to become a tidy subject under Roman dominance. If the practice of curing a body involves rendering that body capable again, according to the normative dictates of dominant culture, maybe Rabbi Tzadok refuses to perform for the powers. His body is a body that will not work for empire, that will not become an able body under imperial regimes. So far I've used the Tzadok story to lift up several points, to recognize the way that cure can, under certain circumstances, become an imposition, kind of violence, to affirm the significance and importance of bodily sovereignty, and to imagine the possibilities that disability may be a kind of resistance, an insistence that bodies matter, real fleshy bodies matter, even when they cannot labor, that our lives are worth more than our capacity to earn and to work. Now let me turn back to the Tzadok stories one more time to pick out a detail that I find quite striking and quite important for grappling with the realities of disability. There's something quite different about Tzadok and most of our experiences with disability. Rabbi Tzadok experiences physical weakness and bodily change as a result of a deliberate, intentional set of religious acts. Right? He fasts and he takes on disability for the sake of saving Jerusalem. Right? It's an extraordinarily noble act. The rabbis imagine him as a heroic figure, I think, in part, for the way he chooses disability, the way he deliberately deploys his body for the public good. So the Tzadok stories participate in a kind of rabbinic fantasy, one that's frankly not so dissimilar from 21st century America, a fantasy that valorizes having control over the body, that fetishizes agency over weakness, that likes to tell disability stories that celebrate a triumph of the spirit or the power of the will. For most of us with disability, that's not how the story goes. I recoil from that kind of story because it uses disability, I think, to sell us a lie, that life is only worth living if we are the captain of our fates or the masters of our destiny. One of the subtle but serious costs of the quest for the cure is that it risks framing life as meaningful only when we are hale and hearty, healthy and well. Perhaps that's what I resist most about the curative imaginaries. The way they imagine my disabled life as a life on hold, a life of waiting for a cure. The way they telescope the vibrant complexities and realities of my life to one thing alone, a fantasy I didn't author, and a dream that I don't even share. Disability is a vital part of how I know myself, how I have come to know my world. It is central to my embodied experience, to my politics, to my passions. Strip away disability, and you strip away an important part of who I am. So come back with me, if you will, one more time to the last story of Rabbi Tzadok, the one where his body never heals. Perhaps this isn't a story of resistance or refusal. Perhaps cure is simply not on the horizon. Perhaps this is a story that allows us to acknowledge disability is a part of the fabric of our lives, an ordinary part of what it means to be human. Imagine with me, if you will, Tzadok's unhealed body, his ordinary disabled life as a life that matters as it is. Sure, there's pain. Sure, there's loss. But I like to think there's also pleasure. I like to imagine Tzadok together with his son. I like to think about the gift Tzadok gave him when he accepted his touch and his care. I like to think about how Eliezer used to bathe him, running a soapy cloth over his father's back and shoulders. The gentleness there, the tending. I like to think that there were things that Tzadok savored, that he used to sit outside on a Galilee hillside and let the summer sun kiss his leathered skin. That when the almond trees bloomed in the springtime, he knew they bloomed in part for him. I like to think he knew his life was counted, that he mattered, he was loved, that disability was part and parcel of that loving, a kind of signature, an essential thread within his story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts Belser for certainly eye-opening and very informative presentation and discussion. Now it's an opportunity for us to engage in some conversation, to ask some questions.
Absolutely.
Just a friendly reminder, we have Men's Club Shabbat this weekend for sermons and statements, but this is the time for questions, which usually end in uptick in our voice or a question mark. but I'll open the floor up for questions now. Yes. I'm coming.
So I'm very sensitive to the question of, again, increased genetic testing and increased medical knowledge leading to the fear of extinguishing disabled lives before they even have a chance to be born. But I'd like to come back to your idea of CRISPR and genomic alteration, and wondering if you feel any different when the disability is an illness that is life-limiting, as opposed to a disability that would allow a complete disabled life, whether or not there might be an intellectual disability or a physical difference to enhance that.
Absolutely, I do, and I don't feel actually that it's, so I think that this is again why it's important to me to emphasize the kind of making of space for scientists, for bioethicists, for the broader public to listen to critiques that are coming from specific disability communities, not to say wholesale, right? Never engage, and I think these technologies are extraordinarily promising, right? Some of them, right? And that they have tremendous potential to, in some cases, improve and extend and offer possibilities for a life well lived with disability or without it, right? So yes, I think that what you're suggesting makes a lot of sense to me. The concern that I have is that there seems to me often to be an extraordinary gap between the sort of public embrace of these technologies whole scale, right? That often overwrites the kind of protest that emerges from specific communities, especially that fear the kind of don't edit me out question, right? Coakley's question. But also in some cases, I think there are disability communities. I'm thinking here about some of the protests that emerged out of some of the muscular dystrophy communities. This is not about CRISPR particularly. This was before. This was against the Muscular Dystrophy Association's telethon. Right? That was a telethon that really focused on generating money and widespread support, donations, particularly for the cure. Right? And the critique that came from disability activists there, from many activists, many of whom were former poster children, right? Saying this kind of focus, right? This sort of raising of money for the cure rather than raising of money for essential life-giving services, right? There was a critique there also, and that was silenced, repeatedly silenced by many of the folks at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. So generally, I think I'm in line with where you're going, right? But even so, I want to really underscore that importance of listening. What I guess I would like to say is listening for the no, or listening for the caution, right? That because disability communities are often deeply marginalized communities, it becomes, I think, especially important for ethicists, for bioethicists, and for the public to kind of listen for that alternative voice, since it's one that we don't necessarily hear as frequently.
We'll make our way around this way.
Well, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yes.
So if you have CRISPR, you want to,
you want to fix everything.
Right,
Yeah.
fix everything. So I guess I'm interested to know your perspective on this question. Where exactly, or is it possible to, can you, should we, ought we, to draw a distinction between disability and disease?
It's an interesting one. It's a tricky question. It's a good question. It's a question that's worth thinking about, because I think it gets us to think about the question of what do we mean when we talk about disability at all, right? So I'm a person who, I think about disability in a couple of different ways. As I mentioned a little bit in my talk, I think first of all, I tend to, so the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, takes a pretty functional approach to disability, right? So disability is, for the ADA, if you have a disabling condition, it is a condition that limits in a significant way a certain area of daily life or functioning. That's a kind of functional approach to disability, and I think that's not a bad. I mean, it has some merits, right? Some people would take a more diagnostic approach to disability, right? And so and then also there's places and communities where a sort of identity approach is really. So the question often comes up, are deaf people disabled? Okay? Many people who identify as deaf resist thinking about deafness as a disability. Okay? And instead talk about deafness, as I mentioned in my talk, a kind of cultural minority status, right? And are a bit uncomfortable with categorizing deafness as a disability. I say all that to say we don't really know, right? We don't have a good definition for what disability itself is, right? So this is my attempt to say, I think and then so for example, people living with chronic illness. There are absolutely communities, right? I could certainly identify and think about and here I'm talking particularly about a kind of kinship connections between people who, this is a really quite vibrant community of folks living with chronic fatigue and ME. The rise of the sort of growth of internet culture has massively led to increased opportunities for forming disability communities, because it means you don't have to have a neighbor, right? Or you don't need a local community. You can also find a kind of community of people who share your disability experience. So I would absolutely say that I am open to and would include people with many forms of chronic illness under my broad brush, right? Disability, if you want to be in, right, you can be in. Same question comes up with people who have learning disabilities or learning differences, right? In fact, the US Census, right, the most recent census, 1 out of 5 Americans, virtually 1 out of 5 Americans, identified themselves as having a disability. 1 in 10 said that they had a significant disability. Okay? So this is quite a large category, but it is never going to be, right? It's never going to be an airtight category. There's a lot of moving in and out of this category. So personally, I think the attempt to kind of get a sort of perfect category to know exactly who's in and who's out is a project that will never really be possible. Okay?
More questions?
So I look up disability on my phone app.
Yes, what does your phone say?
And it says disadvantage with synonyms of affliction, ailment, defect, disqualification, drawback, impairment,
Yeah,
et cetera,
yeah.
et cetera. So it makes me think that those who have disabilities, by accepting that term, are acknowledging that they're in some way inferior than others.
Mm-hmm.
So my suggestion would be, if you don't want to be looked upon that way, come up with a different term that doesn't have this impairment connotation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons that the term disability is really important to me, right? As I mentioned, I claim disability as a significant part of my own identity, and I tend to be opposed to other terms that strike me more euphemistically, right? Like differently abled, right? So I like disability as a term, right? And I like it because it names a significant part of my own experience. That is, I do think that for much of my own experience, right, much of my life, people have seen my experience living with a disability as a kind of disadvantage, as a kind of impairment, right? There's been a fair amount of stigma that has gone along with disability. I would rather say, yeah, I see that stigma, right, and I disagree with it. Right? I'd rather turn it on its head, right, reclaim it in a sense, than give that term up and try to seek out a different one. I think people have different approaches to that, though. That's why I would, when I mentioned that I think the question of do you self-identify with disability, that's a salient question, because I don't want to go around imposing that category on other people. Right? I think that's a sort of inappropriate move as well. Okay? So that's why this question of if a person with chronic illness, right, if a person with a learning difference identifies themselves as a person with a disability, right, that makes sense to me. Then my understanding of that term and that category is open to that and would welcome that affiliation. Right? But I avoid going around with a diagnostic map in my head and trying to. I just am not in the business of categorizing people. Okay. Yes. Oh, the microphone is coming.
Okay. I know you said it's on the screen. It said something about that the danger of that a cure would wipe out disabilities or something. I don't know how to paraphrase something like that.
Sure, sure.
As a person with not so visible disabilities, I have huge problems with that. That really just kind of just makes me feel quite uncomfortable because I don't embrace my disabilities because people don't see it. A lot of times it is a problem because people expect I can do things that I can't do.
Yeah.
But if someone could give me a, stick a stem cell in my brain and cure my short-term and impaired working memory, short-term memory, and give me back my multitasking, and could give me back my gas exchange in my lungs so I wouldn't have to sleep with oxygen at night, I would take that in a second.
Absolutely.
So it just, some of what you said just seems extremely uncomfortable. And also what someone had said about disease versus, I thought that this situation, the stories with the rabbi, to me it sounded more like malnourishment or something like that. It didn't sound so much as disability, but
So first of all, I want to.
I've heard like what you said about dwarfism. I've heard of that, but it's hard to understand. I don't know if you could explain a little more.
Sure.
How people think it's a cure is no good.
So first of all, I want to first of all absolutely affirm your own experience and to say that I think that the exchange that we're having right now is an example, right? An important example of what I mean by we cannot and dare not reduce disability experience to a single voice or a single perspective, right? It's an extraordinarily diverse, complex experience, and there are many people who identify or don't identify with disability, right, who would say, if a cure were available, sign me up immediately. Right? I, in my talk, focused a little bit on what I think is a less familiar phenomenon, right? This idea to a certain kind of resistance to cure, because my sense is that that's a less common experience, that people don't have as much of an opportunity to think with and talk about. But again, the kind of experience you're describing is why I am opposed to saying no to medical research, right? I think that would be utterly misguided, right? What I'm saying is it's imperative to have have sustained conversation with people who are most affected by a particular, again, we want to speak in particular kind of therapy, particular kind of intervention, right? So that those folks have a seat at the table. Right? It's also important to, so one of my first jobs was working in HIV/AIDS activism, and so I come to this work, to disability work, and thinking about the politics of medical research quite a lot, and the way in which certain conditions have not always gotten medical research, medical attention, right? So this is a whole other dimension of the political question around healing, right? And around disability bioethics, right? Is thinking about how to direct attention to communities and individuals who really are in urgent need of better research and better therapeutic options. Okay. Also just want to name a difference that you also addressed in your remarks, which is the difference between people whose disabilities are visible and people who experience invisible disability, because that's also a very different kind of dynamic. I think it's just worth being alert to the fact that disability manifests in very different ways, right? And it doesn't map neatly, right? One wants a cure, one doesn't want the cure, right? That's not the take-home message here, right? But it's also a really important dimension of some of these differences. Okay. Yeah.
So can you tell me, within these disability communities, how significant is this resistance, percentage-wise, of the population that may say no to a cure or no to changes?
So I live in Washington, D.C., which is the place, the home of Gallaudet. So I have the joy of being in a city that has a vibrant, thriving deaf culture and deaf community. And so I am very aware of the degree of deaf concern and concerted activism against technologies that feel like a threat. Right? It's also helped me get a better understanding about the way in which cochlear implant technology, as I mentioned, is beginning to shift. Right? That now I see the whereas 15 years ago there was very strident opposition in many activist deaf communities against any kind of engagement with cochlear implants. Now that's really changing, and we see a lot more openness in deaf communities to thinking in an integrative way. But I think, as my colleague Teresa Blankmeyer-Burke mentions, right, CRISPR is a bit of a different issue because it could, should those kind of therapies be adopted for human use, nip deafness out of a child's experience entirely.
I have a question back here.
I want to go in a slightly separate, like more towards the Judaism and disability concept. Great. And I apologize because I can't remember the exact instance, so I'm going to sort of paraphrase. But I've done some Talmudic study, and I think it was when we were studying the book of Esther. But there are parts in the things I've read that basically say if you are blind or deaf or not quite all there, you don't count for X. Mm-hmm. And I get, like, how do you, like, we're not quantifying those people, and I feel like, you know, we're talking about bringing disability to the forefront and saying that it's not a bad thing, but these people aren't counted.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is why I think that one of the moves that is extraordinarily meaningful to me in contemporary Jewish communities, really, I think, across the different Jewish spectrums, increasingly today we are seeing communities working within their own cultural and halachic frameworks to try and say yes, as much as is possible, to people with disabilities in their communities. That is a change that I think is, that I see that as a sea change, really, as again, it's very different depending on the halachic norms of a particular community, right? So we see that practice look different in place. There is, within Jewish law and tradition, a number of, there's a number of halachic frameworks that do both stigmatize and also limit the participation of people who are marked as having certain kinds of what we today call disabling conditions. Right? And I think a really significant move in and among Jewish communities today is an attempt to look at those restrictions and to assess whether there is the possibility of saying yes, whether there is the possibility within the halachic framework of affirming a person's, right? I think the dignity piece has always, right, that idea has always been within the tradition, right? But it has sometimes been subordinated. So I think there's resources within the tradition already that allow us to make that argument, right? But the work hasn't always been done, and that's why I'm extraordinarily proud and grateful to be living in a moment when so many rabbis, communities, Jews are thinking about living out our tradition differently.
I have a question,
Yes.
but just specifically to the conservative movement, Rachel, I'll add, that triad you're talking about is often cheresh, shoteh, and katan. A cheresh is someone who's deaf. A shoteh is someone who lacks dat, who lacks knowledge. There are different translations for it, and a katan is a minor, right? Essentially, it seems like the rabbis who prize knowledge over everything else, or cognition or everything else, knowing what's going on, assume that those who are deaf or those perhaps with intellectual disabilities, I'll put a bookmark there for a second, would then not have the knowledge to perform the mitzvot to do that. The conservative movement, the law committee already, I forget, maybe 10 years ago, Rabbi Pamela Baumrash wrote a very nice tshuva about the cheresh, someone who is deaf, showing that how we view deafness today is much different than they did, and much of it came from a feeling that if someone could not speak, then they could not understand, which we know is not necessarily the case today, and has affirmed that someone who's deaf is fully obligated at mitzvot. And the tshuva that I mentioned earlier that I'm working on right now deals with the shoteh, and basically showing that those with intellectual disabilities don't fall into that category, and therefore also would be people who would be obligated in mitzvot, which is something that has been affirmed by other Orthodox authorities in other places as well too. So there's more to those pieces in the Talmud than what meets the eye right there. But it's a good question. But since you brought up the Jewish stuff, I want to stay on the Jewish stuff for a second too. My question is about prayer, right? And thinking about what you've been saying about a cure, right? And we pray, of course, in Misha Berach, the prayer for healing, in particular for refuah shlema, right? A complete recovery, a healing of body and soul.
Yeah.
And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about, in your understanding of cure, and I understand this kind of straddles that disability disease issue that Bob brought up before, how you understand prayers for healing functioning within, with people, especially with chronic illnesses or other sorts of, conditions or diseases where, we're praying for a full cure, and you're saying maybe that's not the case.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is a place where I would really like us together to think more about what does it mean to, I'm going to use the term, wish people well, when we think it's not really likely that they will get well. Okay? We often have a very teleological, a very end-directed, goal-directed kind of approach to thinking about healing. Okay? And so my own feeling is that it might be helpful for us to relax a little bit on the idea that healing has to look a particular way, that there's in fact only sort of one kind of healing, kind of well-being, right, that might happen for a person. It's I mean, there have been moments in my life where I have actively wanted communities to offer a Misha Berach on my behalf. They have, in my case, never been specific around my disability experience. Right? But there's certainly been moments when I have wanted a community's prayer. There have also been times when I felt community's prayers sort of pressed upon me in a way that felt really icky and awkward. Right? I remember giving a talk somewhere and someone coming up afterward and saying, "Oh, well, we'll keep you on your Misha Berach, on our Misha Berach list." And I'm just thinking, I don't think I think we're having a real disconnect here. And it just felt like an extraordinary moment of not being seen or heard. I think about this also with folks who are dealing with long-term chronic conditions, where often in, so maybe a person's been away from shul for a little while, and then they come back, and you want to say something nice to them, so you say, "Oh, you're looking so good." Well, they're feeling terrible, right? They're feeling awful, right? So this is not just a matter of formal Misha Berach. It's also, I think, a question of, can we increase our capacity to be present with folks, right? Without necessarily demanding, right, or expecting that the only acceptable trajectory for someone's life is that they will move toward it, that it's always moving toward getting better, because it's not always getting better. And that, I think, that asks something of us spiritually. Right? That asks something of us, right, to be present with our own uncertainty, maybe our own anxieties. Right? It takes a certain quietness. So in terms of when it comes to healing, when it comes to Misha Berach's, I'm a big believer of it takes consent for healing. Right? So I think that, of course, we are not always in a case of knowing whether a person gives or does not give their consent. Right? But if you get some indication, right, I always, personally, my own practice is always to ask a person, right, if I have the opportunity to do so, would you, to say, it's my custom to offer prayers, to offer thoughts for folks in times of trouble, would you like me to mention your name? And sometimes people say yes, and sometimes they say no. And, no means no. So that piece, that question of might we develop a more nuanced way of thinking about healing as something that is a joint project, right? Not just something that's pressed upon people. And then, that piece of, I find myself trying to become more willing to be present with folks when it's not going well. I think that sometimes I feel our desire for cure, for healing, to pray, is an attempt to short-circuit that discomfort, right? And that grief. But that's where I come back to that sense of, for me, sometimes being with disability means acknowledging that this is how it is. Yes.
Is it on? Yeah. You've been talking a lot about how there are so many different facets to the disability community, and that you really can't speak for the community as a whole. That you can't speak for the community as a whole, and that there are so many different viewpoints and diverse viewpoints within the disabled community. And I guess my question is how to be an ally to a community that has so much variation within it. I'm thinking back to like the cochlear implant discussion, and obviously in that situation, to look for the reaction of the deaf community, because that's who's most directly affected. But what about situations where people with many disabilities could be affected, and you don't even necessarily know which voices to listen to or where to look for input? How do you try to be open to hearing those voices when you don't know whose voices they are?
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a really wonderful, it's a wonderful and important question. I think that we are living in a moment where there's a really a flourishing of disability arts and cultures. So there's a lot of people writing out of disability experience, making art, theater, et cetera, out of disability experience. That is one of my first go-tos, right? When people want to know, how do I learn more? How do I know more, right? It's probably not, right? I would like to suggest it's not someone you just meet on the street. Right? I'm sort of a paid professional. It's my job to have conversations with people about disability. When I'm at my home shul, though, right, just like get ready to grab something over Kiddush, it's not really a time when I want to engage strangers about disability experience either. So even though I often wear my my disability educator hat, right? There's moments when I'm not into that either. So this is why I think my first suggestion would be to really look for, and some of the memoir, there's actually a lot of I think I mentioned the internet as a place where we're really seeing a lot of disability community happen. That's another spot, some blogs, activist community. One of the things that's tricky is that some of the biggest name and easiest to find sort of big banner disability organizations are not always the places where you will find kind of more grassrootsy voices. And my own tendency, my own interest is often not to go there, but to look for more incipient, grassroots kind of people's voices. So that's where I found this kind of work to be really helpful. Disability dance and theater also is an extraordinary place to see people where folks have really crafted work that is sharing dimensions of their own disability experience. So thank you so much for that question.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Are there any more questions? No? Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. It's really provocative,
Thank you.
rich talk. And I guess as I've been listening to your talk and then the conversation, I found myself thinking about, you ended with this note of disability as being, I'm paraphrasing it, maybe I'm not quite getting it right, but something built into the human condition. And I found myself thinking about limit. We're all limited.
Yeah.
Some may claim, some identify as disabled, others may not. But when you say disability, it suggests, well, getting back to an earlier point, ability. I guess I find myself thinking about inability. I have a lot of inabilities. Some I would love to be able to change. Others I'm fine with, others I've made peace with. But I guess I wonder if part of what you're saying to me or to others is that there's a call for each of us to consider our own inabilities. And I guess I'm thinking of, there may be folks who are, in some sense I want to say we could universalize disability and say that there are some who are just don't know that they're a member of a disabled community.
Yeah, so I think that this is, you're really picking up on I think, a very significant theme here. There is, on the one hand, a tremendously, virtually universal experience here, right? A sense that I would like to go out on a limb and suggest that everyone in this room either has or knows someone, right, who experiences some kind of limitation, right? Some kind of limit. Now, I will say, though, I am personally not a fan of saying we're all disabled, really. Right? And this is why I hold on, I'm going back to an earlier place here, why I hold on to the identity of disability as a significant way of naming something particular about my own experience, right, that is different from non-disabled people. It's a little bit a question of degree, right? It's a question of the degree to which I have not fit into normative notions. This is, again, not, in my case, it's partly about being seen not to fit. But remember, we always want to remember that not everyone's disability is visible, right? So it's sometimes the sense of just being out of step, right? Being not fitting in the dominant paradigm. That experience is, that's what I would identify. You asked me before about how would I identify the category of disability. The real way I would go to it is to say, if you have that experience of not fitting, right, in some significant way because of a physical, mental health, learning-related difference, that's what I'd go for when I think about this category of disability. Right? But that said, yes, absolutely. I do think there is something profoundly universal here. And this is why I think disability is it's worth it for all of us, whether we identify as disabled or non-disabled, it is worth it for all of us to think with, to spend time with, to kind of spiritually sink into this thinking about limit and disability, because it is so deeply baked into the human condition. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts Belser, for blessing us with your presence and wisdom here this evening. Just one reminder that this evening's program was recorded and will soon be up on our website, so you can rewatch the program if you'd like or direct others' attention to it. tbsonline.org/bioethics. Also, all of our other lectures and programs are up there on the website as well. We also want to invite everyone in just a moment at the conclusion of the program to join us in the Friedman Social Hall for dessert and further conversation. One more time, Toda Rabba for your deep Torah. Thank you, Rabbi Watts Belser.